Discussions in this show should not be construed as specific recommendations or investment advice. Always consult your investment professional before making important investment decisions. Securities offered through registered representatives of Cambridge Investment Research, a broker-dealer member FINRA SIPC. Advisory services through Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
Welcome to Money Matters with Chris Hensley, where we spotlight financial literacy issues in the Houston community and beyond. And now your host, Chris Hensley.
I think they're fundamentally, I think they're afraid that they are of death, in that they're running out of time. So fundamentally, I think the pressure of all of this stuff to do and not enough time to get it done. So I think that's where it starts. I also think they haven't had the experience to see a bigger impact by experimenting with different thinking and behavior. Since 1991, I have taken 6 weeks off a year since the start. And somebody said, "How do you do it?" I said, "Look, we make our numbers in 46 weeks. That's how you do it. We're operating on a 46-week year." And I've taken that, that time off so that, I will be 70 years old next year.
What if the reason you're exhausted, overwhelmed, and constantly chasing the next thing is because you've been taught that faster always means better? Today on Money Matters, I'm joined by executive coach and author Ralph Simone, and this conversation might completely change the way you think about success, productivity, and performance. Ralph's book, Slow Down to Go Faster, flips the script on hustle culture and reveals why the highest performers aren't always the busiest people in the room. We talk about burnout, leadership, decision-making, and the hidden cost of constantly operating in reaction mode. If you're building a business, leading a team, managing wealth, or simply trying to keep up in a nonstop world, this episode is for you. This is Money Matters, and it starts right now. Ralph, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Chris, I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we were talking before that we hit record here, and this is truly one of those word of mouth type things. Oops. I'll mention this right away at the beginning here. My wife, Heather, went to a leadership retreat last week. It was in New York. And she had nothing but good things to say about your book, Slow Down to Go Faster, which was part of the content there at the leadership retreat. So I said, you know what? There was a couple things she mentioned. She mentioned that you co-authored or there was some co-writing here with Rennie, who is your son. And I just recently published a book in April, and my son did some of the stuff. And so I said, you know what? There's some connection points here. So I'm very thankful that you took the invite here. Let's just dive right into it. Why did you write the book, Slow Down to Go Faster?
Well, it's been a long time coming, and I wrote it because I've often thought there's got to be a better way to live and work. And my early career, I came out of public accounting and consulting, and I had some early success, but I saw that it was going to be a grind for a lot longer than I was interested in grinding it out. And I quit my job with no job, no work, and I started my own business. And this was back in November of 1991. And I've been for 35 years working on figuring out a better way. And I keep tweaking it. Every year, I think I learn a lot more that helps me apply some of these principles in an impactful way.
I love it. I love it. Now, the book, its title is Slow Down to Go Faster. Now, that sounds almost contradictory in today's hustle culture. What inspired that message?
So I was inspired on that message by the philosopher and martial artist Chuck Norris. In fact,
I love it.
Chuck just recently passed away, and I read his book one of his books in the early 90s. I think it's called The Secret Within. And he shared a story of a sparring match he had with Bruce Lee. And for the listeners that aren't familiar with the martial arts, both men were talented, but Bruce Lee was probably the more talented, the quicker of the two martial artists. And in one of the sparring matches, Lee was frustrated because he couldn't land any kicks. He wasn't able to block the punches of Norris. And after the match, he was lamenting. He goes, I just couldn't land anything. And Chuck Norris looked at him. He said, "You were going too fast. You need to slow down to go faster." And so that was the inspiration for the book. It appears in the first chapter. Happened to be reading the book when I was training for my first degree black belt. And it was sticky for me, Chris. It was really sticky.
Wow, that is a image there. Anybody who has to or is giving Bruce Lee a run for his money, you got to pay attention to for
Absolutely.
sure, for sure. I love that. Many leaders feel constant pressure to move faster and do more. How do you know when speeding up is actually hurting performance?
It's a great question. And I think part of it is you got to build pauses in and throughout your day so that you can witness on whether the pace you're moving is having an impact or not. You know, I have to, I smile at this because I have to remind some people it's not slow down to go slower. It's slow down to go faster. We're looking to have a bigger impact. And I think in terms of physical fitness, in terms of relationship building, in terms of aligning strategy, some of those require more of an investment in energy than we're often willing to make. And at some point, we pay the price for not investing that time and energy along the way.
So you shared with listeners those pauses throughout the day, the idea of it's not slow down to go slow, it's slow down to go fast, right? And you mentioned
Absolutely.
things like not just our professional life, but also relationships, things that you wouldn't intuitively think, hey, you're going to have to go slower for these things. But I think that's very strong, very important to know. What does slowing down practically look like for busy executives, entrepreneurs, or professionals who already feel overwhelmed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it starts with something I learned from Dan Sullivan, who's out of Toronto, called the Strategic Coach. And Dan would talk about working in the business, working on the business, and spending time out of the business. And I think for senior level executives, business owners, it's intentionally spending more time on the business, the strategy part, the vision, the relationship building, but it's also spending enough time out of the business so that you can bring a fresh and healthy perspective to where you want to go next. And I think Gerber also wrote in the E-Myth how entrepreneurs and sometimes senior leaders, they spend too much time in the business and they lose a sense of perspective. They lose a sense of context. And then they may be moving fast and working hard, but at a very high energetic cost.
Wow, I can relate to this. Hearing this, Michael Gerber, you mentioned the book E-Myth by Michael Gerber. I think that's checking the box for a lot of entrepreneurs. That's one of those books you read right away when you get started in business there. You talked about Dan Sullivan being in the business, taking time to be out of the business, but some of those high performance over function. People need to be told that sometimes you got to grab us by the shoulders and sit us down.
Yeah.
That's just how a lot of them are wired. So this is great news to my ears.
Well, and the biology of this is that when we're on go all the time, if we're on all the time, we're activating the sympathetic nervous system. So we're in this fight or flight mode, and we're not counterbalancing it with the parasympathetic nervous system. And so we're always on. And certainly technology, while a beautiful thing, has made us on even more than we used to. And so I think it's being intentional about creating those off times so that you can re-energize, replenish your energy.
I love that. I've got a whole list of questions I want to ask you, but the technology thing, boy, that's something that's in our face every day, right? We've got our phones buzzing at us, we've got the internet, we've got TV, and so this is your book is very it's timely, but for this overwhelm that people are getting with technology, I think it's super important. I'm going to pivot a little bit and get
Sure.
back into your experience about coaching leaders because that was Heather came out as a leadership retreat, and I was like, man, this sounds like good stuff. I want to hear more about it. In your experience coaching leaders, what are the biggest mistakes people make when trying to improve productivity and performance?
Wow. So I think they move too fast. So they're almost
Hmm.
too quick to action. They don't spend enough time clarifying and ensuring there's understanding and alignment on where they're going or where they want the organization to go. And I think they fail to miss some of the opportunities in messaging from people who are either complaining about being overworked or burned out. There's something there, right? There's something that
Hmm.
suggests we ought to look at the pace. And I think you can achieve a lot um, as a driver. You can achieve a lot throwing hours at it, but at what energetic cost, and is it sustainable? So I think they make the mistake of not looking at it from a systems perspective.
Mhm.
I think we also make mistakes by not looking at both and. How do we go slow and fast? How are we both strategic and tactical? How do we focus on relationships and task? And I think the one thing that the conjunction of and in place of or, I think would help leaders manage their businesses much differently.
So we're going to work backwards here. So the
Sure.
idea of and not giving up on one thing to offset the other, right? It can be both. You can build the relationships, but you can also be a strategic thinker. You can have the systems in place without and lean into your driver, but don't give up on the signals we're getting from somebody who might be not leadership up or across level, down level. These are free signals that we're getting, Rich, and there's
Absolutely.
value, and we should be curious when we hear these let's say complaints. There's truth to
Absolutely.
them. What can we get from that? And you shared with us, that mistake of moving too fast and not stopping to get clarity, some meaning. What is this all about, right? Very, very important stuff here for listeners. Now, you talk about the power of pausing. Can you share an example where stepping back led to a breakthrough or better decision?
I could think of a couple. I'll start with my training in the martial arts. So when you get trained in the martial arts, when you get attacked, you need to be able to break that attack. If somebody grabs you, you need to be able to break it, right? Maybe counter. But the very next move is to step back, to create some space between yourself and the attacker so that both of you can make a choice, right? What's the next move? So that's a personal example. Um, in business, I think it's we take a couple weeks to think about what our strategy for the next 3 years are. Um, and instead of hitting the ground running, we invest the time and energy, and then quarterly check in to see how we're doing. So I think these pauses, they're intentional pauses that ensure a couple things. Is our ladder leaning against the right wall? And are we moving up it at the rate and speed that we think we should? And so, process improvement, Kaizen events, these are all things that absolute financial planning. I've been working a long time. I could have stopped maybe 10 years ago because I created the plan and then executed the plan that allowed for, financial stability. And I think, even when I started my business, I quit with nothing. I didn't have a job. I was standing up my own business. but I had 2 years of salary in the bank. And so
Wow.
I didn't need to sell a single job. And so I think those are examples, and saving, save for a rainy day, but you're putting something in the bank so that you can draw on it if needed later. And I think savings is a wonderful example of slowing down to go faster and investing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Having that kitty or the nest egg to pull from when you're starting up in a business. I know for our salespeople out there, there is that kind of magic pool that when you absolutely need it and you're hungry for it, it's not going to work. But if you've taken that time saving up for it and putting that aside and having the funds there, things happen. And so that's super important. You talked about having the ladder on the right wall. You talked about taking that pause and stepping back. And maybe it's not a 30-day plan. Maybe it's not a 90-day plan. The example you used was 3 years. It's like, let's look at a 3-year plan for what we're going to do. And then having those quarterly check-ins and the idea of a financial plan, putting a plan together before you take action and move. Those ideas fit very well with that idea of taking a pause. Stress and burnout have become major issues in the workplace. Why do you think so many high achievers struggle to disconnect and recharge?
Well, I think they're fundamentally, I think they're afraid that they are going to of death in that they're running out of time. So fundamentally, I think the pressure of all of this stuff to do and not enough time to get it done. So I think that's where it starts. I also think they haven't had the experience to see a bigger impact by experimenting with different thinking and behavior. Since 1991, I have taken 6 weeks off a year since the start. And somebody said, "How do you do it?" I said, "Look, we make our numbers in 46 weeks. That's how you do it. We're operating on a 46-week year." And I've taken that, that time off so that, I will be 70 years old next year. I still got a lot of energy. I still think I got a lot of runway in the tank. But part of that is because I didn't overextend myself along the way. And that doesn't mean I didn't work hard, but it just is that I was very cognizant of resiliency, preparing for stress, preparing for and being able to deal with stressful situations as they occur. And those are the moments of pause. That's the daily meditation. My morning ritual is 2 hours. I get up quite
Wow.
early and I'm 2 hours in before I take a look at my phone. I'm moving every day and I'm not training for a marathon. I'm not, but I'm 30 minutes on the elliptical. I'm eating a little bit better. So I think those are the pauses that we're talking about. And so that we have the energy and the recovery when life upsets confront us. And I think to me, I'm really excited that I'm still able to work. I'm really excited that I'm still able to make a small contribution, but I don't think it's by accident. I mean, certainly blessed, right, with health, but I don't think it's by accident. I think the energy is there because I have paused along the way, along the journey.
Well, first of all, if you're 70 and you're able to take off this much time a year, we need to be listening to that. I love that. And I hear intention. It's not a thing that just happened. You're with intention. You're having morning time that you've set aside for yourself of 2 hours a day to lean into these things that recharge your battery for the day, for the week, for the month. I did not expect the first answer to be being afraid of death. And I get that. As a male who just hit 52, the idea of legacy and what are we going to leave behind, that I think that drives a lot of things for people out there, whether we
Yeah,
admit it or not.
and some of the drive propels us to do some great things, and it propels us to do some things that perhaps we wouldn't. Um, But I think that's where I've come in my own thinking that when I start to rush, and this may be me projecting, it's because I'm thinking my time is, not infinite. And at some time the clock runs out. And so I want to get this done. I want to get this in. And it's really managing that tension because sometimes you do need to go faster. Sometimes I tell my kids, sometimes you got to go fast to go faster. You got to do something. But what are the indicators that you're moving either too fast or too slow? And notice those indicators before you're dissatisfied with the outcomes.
I love that.
Part of that requires us to be more witnesses of ourselves and how we feel moment to moment, day to day, week to week. Because if we're paying attention, if we're tuned in, we know first when things are off.
So not ignoring that internal voice that it's going to come up. We're going to see it if we're listening there. That idea there. Was there a personal moment or experience in your own life that changed the way you think about success, balance, and performance?
There's probably a couple, but I think, one of them was that I realized when I was working in the big 8 accounting and consulting that no matter how much I worked, no matter how much I had, there would always be someone who had more. So I needed to come to grips with what was enough for me. And I saw a lot of people who were making tremendous amounts of money who did not seem happy. That doesn't mean you can't be happy with lots of money, by the way. It's an and, not an or. But that hit me in a way that said, so what really brings me joy? And what will it take for me to know I am enough, I have enough, and I'm doing enough? So I was struck early by a lot of people were seeming to do a lot in the name of happiness, didn't seem all too happy. And so I said, there's something there, and I want to look at it. And I remember when I left and started my own business, a lot of people misread it, and they thought, well, to make more money, and I made enough money, so I have nothing against making money, but that's not the reason I started my own business. I started my own business so that I could really be in the activities that matter most when they matter most. So I was driving more about what I worked on, when I worked, how I did it. And that really, really changed my life in ways that are hard to explain at times.
As a financial advisor by trade, and I work primarily with retirees, this is a thing I see often when people finally give themselves permission to retire. Often they look back and they say, well, what you started with, it was what was enough for me. There might be a point where you never feel like there's
Yeah.
And so listening to that inner drive and knowing, that maybe we're missing, we need to slow down. I think is super important information for people to have. The book, Slow Down to Go Faster. We're talking with the author, Ralph Simone, today. How can organizations create cultures that value reflection and intentionality without losing momentum or competitiveness?
I think building strategic pauses into the day and modeling. And one of the examples that I loved, and was a suggestion I made to a tech company. And I actually asked the question, I said, what impact do you think taking 2 minutes before the start of every meeting would have on productivity, profitability? And during those 2 minutes, people would reflect on 2 things: what their intention for the meeting was and how they needed to show up in order for that intention to be realized. If you follow many people around, they're back-to-back meetings, they're just getting in, they're still trying to process what they just came from, they're already in the thick of thin things, and they haven't really thought about what's the intended outcome for this meeting, and how do I best contribute to that? Uh, I think about the example of when, you know, children like your son's age, middle school, they start to change classes. So they have 4 minutes to get from this class to that class. And in that time, they can let go of where they were, get focused on where they're going, and really be intentional about what they want to accomplish in that next class, that next meeting. I also think involving more people in inputting to the strategy and having, large group conversations where you can create alignment, right? The process of alignment is created by lots of conversations about where we're going, why we're going there, how we're going to get there. And the more you talk about it, the more you share, the more questions you respond to. I think the more committed people are and the more they understand why the organization is going where they say they're going. So I think building in more planning sessions and really balancing strategy and tactics, right? Relationship and task, making sure that we value both sides of those polarities.
A lot of good information there. The idea first of just bringing in more input. Some of your companies, these large organizations, some of the greatest resources are their employees. And so soliciting and bringing in more feedback and input from the group that you might not have done before it is huge. You also use that example, and I had never thought about it that way, but of a school-age child going to class, and then as they transition to the older age groups there, that they're giving them more time between classes, and that allows them to pause and to think before getting on to their next subject. And then the thing you started with, which one of my biggest pet peeves, is long meetings. So the
Absolutely.
idea of people sitting down and taking an inventory is like, what are we really trying to do? What is the intention of this meeting? You might be able to shave 45 minutes of that meeting if you do it with intention.
Absolutely.
I love that.
I was thinking you'd asked me a question earlier. One of my early successes applying this concept, and I hadn't heard of the phrase, was when I was a foreman building air conditioners years ago. And I was 24 years old, and I've got 30 guys working for me. They're all in their 50s, mid to late 50s, some of their 60s. And we're working overtime. Charges are going up, but we're not getting the units. We're not getting the credits. And I went to one of the guys. I said, help me out. What's going on here? I said, we're working more hours. We're getting the same or less output. And he looked at me, Chris. He said, I'm old. I pace myself. If I know we're going to work 10 hours instead of 8, I got to make sure I make it. And so he was a good guy. He wasn't trying to pull one over on I said, well, let me ask you something. Do you think that we could get the goal, our output goal, on 8 hours a day? He said, absolutely. He goes, you get us the parts, we'll get you the units. So I didn't ask anybody. I just went back to 8 hours. 2 weeks later, the plant manager comes down to see me. He goes, kid, I don't know what you're doing, but you're brilliant. We're getting the units. The costs are down. He goes, tell me your secret. I said, look, I don't think I can complicate it enough for you. All I did was ask a couple of questions and learned a little bit about that these guys are getting tired. And so once we put the goal in front of them, got them what they needed, they got us all the output we needed. That was slowing down to go faster. Less hours, more output. That's the goal. That's the goal.
I think of the older guy who will tell you, yep, it's 8 versus 10, I'm pacing myself. I think of martial arts and energy conservation, right? Being able to save that energy to the end of the match and all of that plays right into it there. We are bumping right towards the end of the show. We're about to hit the 30-minute mark. So Ralph, is there anything that I have forgot to ask you that you'd like to leave with listeners today?
One thing I didn't talk about, you alluded to it at the beginning. Just like you had your son help you with your book, my son and I worked on this together. In many cases, he took the lead, and there was no better experience in life than to work on something like this with a son or daughter. And I once told somebody, if I didn't sell a single copy, it would have been worth the experience of just getting it out there, and for how we both grew in the process, and that was to some extent slowing down to go faster because he was in college during most of the time. We were rarely together, and also he knew a lot more about the publishing process than I did, so it became me taking the direction and the lead from him. But it was just a tremendous process, as I know you realize because of what you experienced with your son.
Absolutely. I love you letting us kind of behind the scenes there in the writing process of working with your son. And then the idea of us having to kind of change roles and take a little bit of direction from the children, different role for us, but we're still learning.
Absolutely.
I
Hopefully
love it.
forever.
Ralph, thank you so much for being on the show. Again, the book, Slow Down to Go Faster. Now, readers can find this on Amazon, bookstores, anywhere
Uh,
books are available.
yeah, online. So it's Amazon. It's available in Audible, and then it's
Mhm.
available in paperback through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and Bookshop, plus many others. But those are the primary. You could also go to our site, Slow Down to Go Faster, which would link you to any of those retailers.
Ralph, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good rest of the day there.
Chris, thank you so much. It's a pleasure meeting you and being a guest on your show. I appreciate you.